The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley as Elena Martinez adjusted her rifle scope for the third time. Her dark hair was pulled back tightly under a worn military cap, and her brown eyes remained fixed on the distant ridgeline. At 28, she had already earned a reputation as one of the most skilled marksmen in her unit, but today would test every ounce of her training and resolve. The small village of San Pedro lay nestled in the valley below, its whitewashed houses gleaming in the early light. For 3 days, enemy forces had been advancing through the mountains, pushing closer to this strategic location that controlled the main supply route through the region. Elena's commanding officer had given her a simple but crucial mission: hold the high ground overlooking the village and prevent enemy advancement for as long as possible. She had chosen her position carefully the night before, finding a rocky outcrop that provided excellent visibility while offering natural cover. The spot was about 800 meters above the village, giving her a commanding view of all approach routes. Her rifle, a precision instrument she had named Esperanza, after her grandmother, rested on a makeshift bipod constructed from fallen branches. Elena checked her equipment one final time. She carried enough ammunition for an extended engagement, water for 2 days, and emergency rations. Her radio crackled softly, maintaining contact with headquarters 15 kilometers away. The plan was straightforward: delay the enemy advance until reinforcements could arrive from the capital city. As the sun climbed higher, Elena spotted the first signs of movement in the forest below. Through her scope, she could see figures moving carefully between the trees, their uniforms marking them as the advance scouts of the enemy force. She counted at least 12 soldiers, but experience told her this was likely just the tip of a much larger force. Her finger found the familiar curve of her rifle's trigger, but she held her fire. Patience was a sniper's greatest weapon, and Elena had learned this lesson well during her years of service. She had grown up in these mountains, hunting with her father since she was 12 years old. Those early morning expeditions tracking deer had taught her to read the landscape, to understand wind patterns, and most importantly, to remain perfectly still for hours at a time. The enemy scouts moved with professional caution, checking corners and maintaining proper spacing. Elena could tell these were not inexperienced soldiers. Their methodical approach suggested they knew about the strategic importance of the village and expected resistance. She watched as they established observation posts at key locations, clearly preparing for a larger force to follow. Through her radio, Elena received updates from other observation posts scattered throughout the region. The enemy was moving in, coordinated columns along multiple routes, suggesting a well-planned offensive. Intelligence reports indicated they were attempting to secure several key locations simultaneously, with San Pedro being a crucial objective in their overall strategy. Elena's position gave her an advantage that went beyond mere elevation. She knew every trail, every hiding spot, every natural feature in this terrain. During her childhood, she had explored these mountains extensively with her older brother Miguel, who had taught her to read the subtle signs that revealed human presence in the wilderness. Those skills had served her well during military training and in previous missions. As the morning progressed, more enemy soldiers appeared in the valley. Elena began making mental calculations about ranges, wind speed, and the best shooting lanes from her position. The enemy force was larger than initially expected, with at least 50 soldiers visible and likely many more still approaching through the forest. Her radio buzzed with an urgent message from headquarters. The reinforcements had been delayed due to mechanical problems with their transport vehicles. Elena would need to hold her position for at least 6 more hours than originally planned. She acknowledged the message calmly, though her heart rate increased slightly at the news. The enemy began establishing a temporary command post in an abandoned farmhouse at the edge of the village. Elena watched through her scope as officers gathered around maps pointing toward various locations and apparently discussing their assault plan. She could take out several key targets from her current position, but doing so would immediately reveal her location and bring concentrated fire upon her position. Elena decided to wait for a more opportune moment. The enemy seemed confident that they controlled the high ground, apparently unaware of her presence. This psychological advantage was valuable and should not be wasted on premature action. Instead, she used the time to study their movements and identify the most important targets for when she finally had to engage. A light breeze stirred the mountain air, carrying with it the scent of pine and wildflowers. Elena tested the wind direction by releasing a few blades of grass and watching their movement. Wind would affect bullet trajectory at these ranges, and she needed to account for every variable that might influence her shots. The enemy force continued to grow throughout the morning. Elena counted over 80 soldiers now visible in the valley, with heavy equipment being moved into position. She could see machine gun teams establishing firing positions and mortar crews preparing their weapons. This was clearly a major offensive operation, not just a probing attack. Her radio crackled again with updated intelligence. Aerial reconnaissance had confirmed that this was part of a larger coordinated assault involving multiple enemy divisions. The strategic importance of holding San Pedro had increased dramatically, as its fall would compromise defensive positions across a broad front. Elena felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. She was no longer just delaying an advance. She was potentially protecting hundreds of soldiers and civilians who depended on the defensive line holding firm. The knowledge that so many lives hung in the balance focused her mind with crystal clarity. As noon approached, the enemy began making their final preparations for assault. Elena could see officers moving between units, giving orders and coordinating timing. Soon she would have to abandon her observer role and become an active participant in the battle. She said a quiet prayer, thinking of her family back home, and hoping she would see them again. The moment of truth was approaching, and Elena Martinez prepared herself for what might be the longest and most important day of her military career. The first shot came at exactly 12:47 p.m., and it was not Elena's. A machine gun position in the village opened fire at what appeared to be shadows moving through the trees. The enemy had begun their assault earlier than expected, catching even Elena slightly off guard. She quickly adjusted her position and brought her rifle to bear on the advancing soldiers below. Through her scope, Elena could see enemy soldiers moving in coordinated teams toward the village perimeter. Their advance was professional and methodical, using natural cover and maintaining communication through hand signals. She selected her first target carefully, an officer who appeared to be directing the assault from a position behind a large boulder. The shot rang out across the valley with a sharp crack that echoed off the mountainsides. The officer dropped immediately, causing confusion among the nearby soldiers who began looking around frantically for the source of the shot. Elena had already shifted her position slightly and was acquiring her next target before the sound of her first shot had finished reverberating through the valley. Her second target was a machine gunner who had set up a position overlooking the main approach to the village. The distance was approximately 600 meters, with a slight crosswind from the east. Elena compensated for the wind drift and squeezed the trigger smoothly. The machine gunner slumped over his weapon, silencing a threat that could have devastated the village defenders. The enemy force reacted quickly to the sniper threat. Elena could see soldiers pointing toward the mountainside where her muzzle flash had briefly appeared. Within minutes, they began directing rifle fire toward her general area, though their shots were falling short due to the extreme range and elevation difference. Elena had anticipated this response and had prepared several alternative firing positions within her defensive area. She moved quickly to her second position, a spot about 30 meters to the east that offered a different angle on the battlefield, while maintaining excellent concealment among the rocks and scrub vegetation. From her new position, Elena could see that the enemy assault had gained momentum despite her interference. Soldiers were advancing through the village streets, engaging in house-to-house fighting with the local militia who had stayed to defend their homes. The sound of automatic weapons fire and exploding grenades filled the air, creating a chaotic symphony of battle. Elena focused on targets that posed the greatest threat to the village defenders. She engaged a sniper who had taken position in the church bell tower, sending him tumbling to the ground below. Next, she targeted a demolitions expert who was preparing to blow up a strategic bridge that the defending forces needed for their escape route. Each shot required careful calculation and precise execution. Elena had to account for range, wind, elevation changes, and the movement of her targets. More challenging still, she had to do all of this while under increasingly accurate return fire from enemy soldiers who were beginning to pinpoint her location through the sound and muzzle flash of her rifle. A bullet struck the rock beside her head, sending stone fragments flying and leaving a white scar on the granite. Elena did not flinch, but instead made note of the direction from which the shot had come. She spotted the enemy sniper positioned on a rooftop in the village below and began calculating the shot needed to eliminate this new threat. The enemy sniper was good, Elena had to admit. His shot had come very close, and he had chosen an excellent position that offered both good visibility and protection. However, Elena had advantages that he lacked: superior elevation, intimate knowledge of the terrain, and a rifle that had been precisely zeroed for these exact conditions. Elena's shot took the enemy sniper in the chest, ending his threat permanently. However, his presence indicated that the enemy force included specialists who were specifically trained to deal with threats like her. She would need to be even more careful about concealment and position changes. The battle in the village continued, to rage with increasing intensity. Elena could see that the local defenders were putting up fierce resistance, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Several buildings were now on fire, sending thick black smoke into the afternoon sky. The smoke actually helped Elena by obscuring her position from some enemy observers. Her radio crackled with an urgent message from the village commander. The defenders were running low on ammunition, and casualties were mounting. They needed immediate support, or they would be forced to retreat within the next hour. Elena acknowledged the message and increased her rate of fire, targeting enemy soldiers who were advancing toward the most critical defensive positions. Elena's ammunition supply was also becoming a concern. She had started the day with 100 rounds of match-grade ammunition, and she had already expended nearly half of that amount. Each shot needed to count, as she could not afford to waste ammunition on uncertain targets. She began prioritizing officers, heavy weapons operators, and specialists who posed the greatest threat to the defense. A mortar shell exploded about 50 meters from Elena's position, showering her with dirt and small rocks. The enemy had brought indirect fire weapons into action and were attempting to neutralize her through area bombardment. Elena knew she would need to change positions more frequently now, as staying in one place too long would invite a direct hit from enemy mortars. She moved to her third prepared position, this one offering better concealment but a slightly more limited field of fire. From here, Elena could still cover the main approaches to the village, but she had fewer opportunities for long-range shots at targets in the valley bottom. The trade-off was worthwhile given the increasing enemy fire directed at her previous positions. The afternoon sun was beginning its slow descent toward the western mountains, casting longer shadows across the battlefield. Elena realized that she had been engaged in continuous combat for over 4 hours, and the physical and mental strain was beginning to accumulate. Her water supply was running low, and she had not eaten since before dawn. Despite the fatigue, Elena's shooting remained accurate. She had developed a rhythm of observe, acquire, fire, and relocate that kept her effective while minimizing her exposure to return fire. Her years of training and natural talent were being tested to their limits, but she was meeting the challenge with professional skill and personal determination. The enemy had also adapted to her presence and was now advancing, more cautiously, using smoke grenades and coordinated movement to limit her opportunities for clean shots. Elena found herself having to take more difficult shots at partially concealed targets, requiring even greater precision and timing. As the shadows grew longer, Elena prepared for what she sensed would be the most critical phase of the battle. The enemy was massing for what appeared to be a final assault on the village center, and the defending forces were reaching the limit of their endurance. Everything would depend on the next few hours, and Elena knew that every shot she fired could determine whether the village survived the day. By mid-afternoon, the intensity of the battle had reached a fever pitch. Elena could hear the desperate radio calls from the village defenders growing more urgent with each passing hour. Ammunition was critically low, several key positions had been overrun, and casualties were mounting among the brave militia members who refused to abandon their homes. Elena had been forced to relocate to her fourth firing position after a concentrated mortar barrage had made her previous spot untenable. Fragments of hot metal had whistled past her head, and one piece had actually torn through her jacket sleeve without touching skin. The enemy was getting more accurate with their indirect fire, which meant they were probably using a forward observer to adjust their aim. From her new position behind a cluster of large boulders, Elena scanned the battlefield through her rifle scope, looking for the forward observer who was directing the mortar fire. She knew that eliminating this target would significantly reduce the threat to both herself and the village defenders. After several minutes of careful observation, she spotted a soldier with radio equipment positioned on a hilltop about 400 meters to her southeast. The shot was challenging due to the angle and the fact that the target was partially concealed behind a tree. Elena had to wait for the observer to move into a better position, which required patience while mortar rounds continued to fall uncomfortably close to her location. When the opportunity finally presented itself, she took the shot without hesitation. The forward observer dropped behind his radio, and within minutes the accuracy of the incoming mortar fire decreased noticeably. Elena allowed herself a moment of satisfaction before returning her attention to the main battle in the village below. The enemy had committed what appeared to be their entire force to this assault, and Elena could see soldiers advancing through every street and alley in the village. The defenders were fighting from rooftops, windows, and hastily constructed barricades, but they were being pushed back steadily toward the village center. Elena shifted her focus to supporting the most critical defensive positions. She could see a squad of enemy soldiers attempting to flank the main defensive line by moving through the village cemetery. The headstones and monuments provided excellent cover for their advance, but Elena had a clear line of sight from her elevated position. She engaged the flanking force with rapid, precise shots, dropping 3 soldiers in quick succession. The remaining members of the squad took cover behind a large marble monument, but their advance had been stopped. Elena kept her scope trained on their position, waiting for them to expose themselves when they resumed their movement. The physical demands of maintaining peak performance for so many hours were beginning to take their toll on Elena. Her shooting hand had developed a slight tremor from gripping the rifle for extended periods, and her eyes were strained from hours of intense concentration through the rifle scope. She took a moment to rest her eyes and flex her fingers before returning to her weapon. A new threat emerged as Elena spotted enemy soldiers setting up what appeared to be a heavy machine gun position on the roof of the village school. This weapon would have a commanding view of the main square where many of the defenders were concentrated. Elena knew she had to eliminate this threat before it could open fire on the exposed defenders. The range was over 700 meters, and the target was partially obscured by the building's architecture. Elena had to wait for the machine gun crew to position their weapon, which would expose them for the few seconds she needed to take her shot. The waiting was nerve-wracking, as she could see the defenders below had no idea of the danger that was about to rain down on them. When the machine gunner finally exposed himself to sight his weapon, Elena was ready. Her shot struck him center, mass, and he toppled backward off the roof. The rest of the crew scrambled to take cover, abandoning their weapon setup. Elena quickly engaged a second crew member who was attempting to retrieve the machine gun, ensuring that this particular threat was permanently neutralized. The sun was now noticeably lower in the western sky, and Elena realized that she had been fighting continuously for over 6 hours. Her ammunition supply was running dangerously low, with fewer than 20 rounds remaining in her possession. Each shot had to be made to count more than ever before. Elena's radio crackled with another urgent message from headquarters. The delayed reinforcements were finally approaching, but they were still at least 2 hours away from reaching the village. The defenders needed to hold their positions for just a little longer, but Elena could see that their situation was becoming desperate. Several buildings in the village center were now burning fiercely, and thick smoke was beginning to obscure parts of the battlefield. The smoke was a double-edged sword. It concealed Elena's position from some enemy observers, but it also made target identification more difficult. She had to be even more careful to ensure she was engaging legitimate military targets and not firing at shadows or friendly forces. Elena spotted a group of enemy soldiers attempting to storm the village hall, where she knew many civilians had taken shelter in the basement. The building's thick stone walls had provided protection throughout the battle, but if the enemy gained control of it, the civilians would be in grave danger. She engaged the assault force with careful, deliberate shots, using her dwindling ammunition to maximum effect. Each round found its mark, and the enemy advanced toward the village hall stalled as soldiers sought cover from the accurate sniper fire. Elena's intervention bought precious time for the defenders to reinforce this critical position. As the afternoon wore on, Elena noticed changes in enemy tactics. They had clearly identified her general location and were beginning to coordinate their movements to minimize their exposure to her fire. Soldiers moved in short rushes between cover points, used smoke grenades more frequently, and maintained better dispersion to reduce the effectiveness of her shots. Despite these adaptations, Elena continued to find opportunities to influence the battle. Her intimate knowledge of the terrain allowed her to predict likely enemy movement routes and position herself accordingly. She had grown up playing in these mountains and knew every rock, tree, and hiding place that could be used to advantage. Close call came when an enemy patrol approached to within 200 meters of Elena's position. She had been so focused on the battle in the village that she had not noticed their flanking movement up the mountainside. Only the sound of displaced rocks alerted her to their presence, giving her just enough warning to relocate before they reached her firing position. Elena moved quickly to her fifth and final prepared position, a natural depression between two large boulders that offered excellent concealment, but limited her field of fire to a narrow sector of the battlefield. From here, she could still cover the most critical approaches to the village center, but she would have fewer opportunities to engage targets on the flanks. The enemy patrol that had nearly discovered her previous position was now searching the rocks where she had been just minutes before. Helena could hear their voices echoing off the stone surfaces as they called out to each other in their own language. They were close enough that she could have engaged them with her sidearm, but doing so would have revealed her current position to the entire enemy force. Instead, Elena remained perfectly still, controlling her breathing and waiting for the patrol to move away from her location. The skills her father had taught her during their hunting expeditions served her well now, as she became one with the mountain landscape, invisible to the enemy soldiers searching just meters away from her hiding place. The enemy patrol spent nearly 30 minutes searching the area around Elena's former positions, before finally giving up and returning to the main battle. Elena remained motionless throughout their search, barely breathing as boots crunched on gravel just meters from her concealed position. When they finally departed, she allowed herself to relax slightly, but she knew that her window of opportunity was rapidly closing. From her current position, Elena could see that the village defenders were being pushed back to their final defensive line around the central square. Buildings on the perimeter were either destroyed or in enemy hands, and the remaining defenders had consolidated into a tight defensive perimeter that was shrinking with each passing hour. Elena's ammunition count was now down to just 12 rounds, each one more precious than gold. She had to make every shot count, focusing only on targets that posed the greatest immediate threat to the surviving defenders. Through her scope, she identified an enemy officer who was coordinating the final assault from a position near the village fountain. The officer was using a radio to direct multiple units simultaneously, making him a high-value target. However, he was positioned behind partial cover and only exposed himself briefly when giving orders. Elena had to time her shot perfectly, waiting for the moment when he would step into the open to point out objectives to his subordinates. Phew. Opportunity came when the officer moved to get a better view of the defensive positions. Elena's shot caught him as he raised his binoculars, and his collapse created immediate confusion among the enemy units he had been coordinating. The loss of central command disrupted their assault momentum, giving the defenders a brief respite. Elena's radio crackled with an update from headquarters. The reinforcements were now less than 90 minutes away, but aerial reconnaissance showed that additional enemy forces were also approaching from the north. It would be a race against time to see whether help would arrive before the village fell completely. The shadows were growing longer as the sun continued its descent toward the western horizon. Elena realized that she had been fighting for nearly 8 hours straight, surviving on nothing but determination and the occasional sip from her nearly empty water bottle. Her body ached from maintaining shooting positions on the hard rock surfaces, but her mind remained sharp and focused. A new development caught Elena's attention as she observed movement in the forest beyond the village. Through her scope, she could see what appeared to be civilians attempting to flee the combat zone. Men, women, and children were moving through the trees, trying to escape the battle that had consumed their home. Elena's heart sank as she realized that some enemy soldiers had spotted the fleeing civilians and were moving to intercept them. The rules of engagement were clear about protecting non-combatants, and Elena knew she had to act quickly to prevent a potential massacre. She redirected her focus from the main battle to this new threat developing in the forest. The range to the enemy soldiers pursuing the civilians was nearly 800 meters, at the extreme limit of her rifle's effective range. Elena had to account for bullet drop, wind drift, and the fact that both the targets and the civilians were moving through dense forest cover. It would be some of the most challenging shots she had ever attempted. Elena's first shot targeted the lead pursuer, a soldier who had gained considerable ground on the fleeing family group. The bullet found its mark, causing the soldier to stumble and fall among the undergrowth. The other pursuers immediately took cover, momentarily halting their advance and giving the civilians precious time to increase their lead. Two more carefully placed shots discouraged the remaining pursuers from continuing their chase. Elena watched, through her scope, as the enemy soldiers decided to return to the main battle rather than risk further casualties in pursuit of civilians through difficult terrain. The family group disappeared deeper into the forest, hopefully reaching safety beyond the combat zone. Elena's intervention to protect the civilians had used 3 more of her precious remaining rounds, leaving her with only 8 shots for the final phase of the battle. She turned her attention back to the village, where the situation had continued to deteriorate during her brief focus on the forest pursuit. The enemy had now penetrated to within 50 meters of the central square, and Elena could see muzzle flashes from small arms fire reflecting off the windows of surrounding buildings. The defenders were fighting with desperate courage, but they were clearly overwhelmed and running out of both ammunition and fighting positions. Elena identified a group of enemy soldiers who were preparing to assault the village hall from the rear, where they would be attacking the building that sheltered the civilian refugees. She could not allow this attack to succeed, as it would put dozens of innocent lives at risk. Using her remaining ammunition with surgical precision, Elena engaged the assault group one by one. Her shots came from an unexpected angle, causing confusion and forcing the enemy soldiers to seek cover rather than press their attack. The assault on the village hall was disrupted, buying more time for the civilians sheltering inside. As Elena fired her final rounds, she noticed movement on the mountainside below her position. The enemy patrol that had searched for her earlier was returning, this time with additional soldiers and what appeared to be a radio direction-finding team. They had likely triangulated her position based on her recent shots and were moving to eliminate the sniper threat once and for all. Elena realized that her time in this position was rapidly coming to an end. She had no more ammunition for her rifle, and enemy soldiers were approaching her location from multiple directions. Her sidearm held 15 rounds, but at the ranges involved it would be useless against soldiers armed with rifles and machine guns. She began preparing for what might be her final stand, checking her remaining equipment and planning her next moves. Elena had succeeded in holding her position for over 8 hours, far longer than anyone had expected possible. She had disrupted enemy plans, protected civilians, and bought precious time for the village defenders and the approaching reinforcements. The radio crackled one final time with a message that brought a glimmer of hope. Advanced elements of the relief force had made contact with enemy scouts just 15 kilometers from the village. If Elena could hold out for another hour, help would arrive. The question was whether she could survive that long with enemy soldiers closing in from all sides. Elena checked the position of the sun, now clearly visible above the western mountains. Sunset was still over an hour away, but the light was already taking on the golden quality of late afternoon. She had fought through the day with skill and determination, but the ultimate test was still ahead. As she heard the sounds of approaching enemy soldiers echoing off the rocky slopes below, Elena Martinez prepared for what would either be her greatest triumph or her final battle. The lady sniper who had held her ground for hours was about to face her most challenging test yet. The sound of boots on stone grew steadily closer as Elena assessed her dire situation. Her rifle ammunition was completely exhausted, leaving her with only her sidearm and the intimate knowledge of terrain she had gained during a childhood spent exploring these mountains. The enemy soldiers approaching her position had the advantage of numbers, superior firepower, and the element of initiative. Elena made the difficult decision to abandon her final firing position before the enemy could surround her completely. She gathered her essential equipment, including her radio and remaining water, then began moving carefully through the rocky terrain toward a series of caves she remembered from her youth. These natural hiding places might offer temporary sanctuary while she developed a new plan. The movement required extreme caution, as any sound of displaced rocks or metallic equipment could alert the searching enemy patrol to her location. Elena used techniques learned from her father during their hunting expeditions, placing each foot carefully and testing her weight before committing to each step. The skills that had once helped her track deer through silent forests now meant the difference between life and death. Behind her, Elena could hear the enemy soldiers spreading out to search the area where she had been positioned just minutes before. Their voices carried clearly in the thin mountain air, and she could tell they were frustrated by her disappearance. One voice seemed to be giving orders, probably a sergeant or lieutenant coordinating the search effort. Elena reached the cave entrance just as she heard a shout from the enemy patrol. They had found evidence of her former position, possibly spent shell casings or disturbed vegetation that marked where she had been lying. The discovery would intensify their search and reduce the time she had to plan her next move. The cave she had chosen was one of several interconnected chambers that formed a natural tunnel system through the mountainside. Elena had explored these caves extensively as a child, and she knew they offered multiple escape routes that would be impossible for the enemy to monitor simultaneously. The darkness inside would also neutralize their numerical advantage by limiting their ability to coordinate effectively. Elena's radio crackled softly with an update from the relief force. They were now engaged with enemy units on the outskirts of the combat zone and making steady progress toward the village. However, they were encountering stronger resistance than expected, which might delay their arrival by another 30 to 60 minutes. Elena acknowledged the message quietly and settled deeper into the cave system. From her concealed position, Elena could hear the enemy patrol calling out to each other as they searched the rocky terrain above the cave entrance. Their lack of familiarity with the local geography was evident in their inefficient search pattern. They were looking in obvious places while missing the subtle indicators that would reveal hidden entrances and concealed positions. Elena used her tactical radio to contact the village defenders, providing them with intelligence about enemy positions and movements she had observed during her extended overwatch. Even without ammunition for her rifle, she could still contribute to the defensive effort by serving as an observation post and communication relay. The defenders reported that they were still holding the central square, though their ammunition situation was critical, and casualties continued to mount. The enemy had temporarily suspended their assault on the village center, possibly to reorganize after the disruption caused by Elena's long-range interference throughout the day. As Elena waited in the cave, she reflected on the events of the past 9 hours. She had started the day as a single sniper tasked with delaying an enemy advance, but the mission had evolved into something much more significant. Her actions had not only delayed the enemy assault, but had fundamentally altered the tactical situation in the village below. The psychological impact of her presence had been as important as her physical effect on enemy forces. Knowing that an accurate sniper was positioned somewhere in the mountains had forced enemy soldiers to move more cautiously, use more cover, and maintain better dispersion. These behavioral changes had slowed their advance and reduced their combat effectiveness throughout the engagement. Elena heard voices directly above the cave entrance and realized that the enemy patrol was now searching the immediate area. She moved deeper into the cave system, using her childhood knowledge of the tunnels to navigate in near-total darkness. The enemy soldiers would be reluctant to enter the caves without proper lighting and cave-clearing equipment, giving her a temporary advantage. Her radio brought news that changed the entire tactical situation. The relief force had broken through the outer enemy defensive line and was now advancing rapidly toward the village. More importantly, they had brought heavy weapons and air support that would shift the balance of power decisively in favor of the defending forces. Elena realized that her role in the battle was transitioning from direct combat to survival and intelligence gathering. If she could evade capture for another hour or two, the arriving reinforcements would likely drive off the enemy force and secure the village. Her mission would be complete, and she would have succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. The sound of helicopter rotor blades echoed through the valley, growing steadily louder as aircraft approached from the south. Elena recognized the distinctive sound signature of military transport helicopters, probably carrying additional troops and supplies for the relief effort. The psychological impact on both friendly and enemy forces would be significant. Through gaps in the cave system, Elena could see enemy soldiers in the valley below beginning to withdraw from advanced positions. The arrival of air support had apparently convinced their commanders that the assault on the village was no longer viable. After hours of fierce fighting, the tactical initiative was finally shifting back to the defending forces. Elena emerged cautiously from the cave system as the sounds of enemy activity diminished in the immediate area. The patrol that had been searching for her seemed to have withdrawn along with the main enemy force, probably recalled to assist with the general retreat from the village. From her vantage point on the mountainside, Elena could see enemy units moving back through the forest in organized withdrawal formations. They were not routing or fleeing in panic, but conducting a professional tactical withdrawal in the face of superior forces. This suggested that the enemy commander was experienced and disciplined, which meant they might attempt another assault in the future. The sun was now clearly descending toward the western horizon, casting longer shadows across the battlefield and painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Elena had been fighting continuously for nearly 10 hours, far longer than she had ever imagined possible when she first took up her position at dawn. Her radio brought the news she had been hoping to hear all day. Elements of the relief force had entered the village and made contact with the defenders in the central square. The immediate threat to the civilian population had been neutralized, and medical personnel were already treating wounded defenders and civilians. Elena began making her way down the mountainside toward the village, moving carefully through terrain that might still contain enemy stragglers or booby traps. Her long vigil was nearly over, but she maintained her vigilance until she could be certain that the danger had truly passed. The lady sniper who had held her ground for hours was finally returning to friendly lines, her mission accomplished against overwhelming odds. As Elena made her way down the mountainside toward the village, the golden light of late afternoon created stark contrasts between the illuminated ridges and the deep shadows in the valleys. The sound of gunfire had largely ceased, replaced by the voices of soldiers calling out to each other, and the distant whine of helicopter engines as aircraft continued to arrive with reinforcements and supplies. Elena paused at a rocky outcrop that offered a clear view of the village below. The scene that greeted her was both heartening and sobering. Smoke still rose from several damaged buildings, and she could see medical personnel moving between casualty collection points, treating wounded soldiers and civilians. Despite the destruction, the village had survived, and its people were alive. Her radio crackled with a message specifically for her. The relief force commander wanted to debrief her personally about the tactical situation and the intelligence she had gathered during her extended observation of enemy forces. Elena acknowledged the message and continued her descent toward the village, carefully choosing her route to avoid areas that might still contain unexploded ordnance or enemy stragglers. As she approached the village perimeter, Elena was challenged by a sentry from the relief force who did not recognize her. After properly identifying herself and providing the day's authentication codes, she was escorted toward the temporary command post that had been established in the village school building. The journey through the village streets revealed the true cost of the day's fighting. Elena saw buildings with walls pockmarked by bullet holes, windows shattered by explosions, and debris scattered across roads that had been peaceful just hours before. However, she also saw something that filled her with pride: the faces of villagers who were emerging from their shelters, alive and free because of the stand that had been made here. Children peered cautiously from doorways while their parents embraced soldiers from the relief force. An elderly woman approached Elena and pressed a small religious medal into her hand, speaking rapidly in the local dialect about prayers and gratitude. Elena accepted the gift with humility, knowing that she had been just one part of a much larger effort to defend these innocent people. At the command post, Elena was met by Colonel Ramirez, the relief force commander, who had been monitoring her radio transmissions throughout the day. He was a veteran officer with graying hair and eyes that showed both weariness and respect as he looked at the young woman who had single-handedly disrupted an entire enemy assault. "Sergeant Martinez," the colonel said formally, "your actions today have been nothing short of extraordinary. The intelligence reports I've received indicate that you maintained effective fire on enemy positions for over 10 hours while under constant threat of counterattack." Elena stood at attention and gave her report in clear professional terms. She described the enemy force composition, their tactics, the equipment she had observed, and the key engagements that had shaped the battle's outcome. Her detailed observations would prove invaluable for understanding enemy capabilities and planning future defensive operations. The colonel listened intently, occasionally asking specific questions about enemy command structure and logistics arrangements. Elena's answers demonstrated not only her marksmanship skills but also her tactical intelligence and ability to analyze complex battlefield situations under extreme pressure. "The preliminary casualty reports show that your interventions saved dozens of lives," Colonel Ramirez continued. "The machine gun position you eliminated early in the engagement would have caused devastating casualties among the village defenders. Your disruption of the flanking maneuver through the cemetery prevented a breakthrough that could have collapsed the entire defensive line." Elena felt a mixture of pride and exhaustion as she listened to the colonel's assessment. The adrenaline that had sustained her throughout the day was finally beginning to fade, and she was becoming aware of the physical toll that 10 hours of combat had taken on her body. Her shooting hand was cramped from gripping her rifle, her back ached from lying on rocky surfaces, and she had not eaten a proper meal in over 15 hours. As the debriefing continued, Elena learned more about the larger tactical picture. The enemy assault on San Pedro had been part of a coordinated offensive involving multiple targets across the region. However, their failure to quickly secure the village had disrupted the overall timeline and allowed defending forces to reinforce other threatened positions. The colonel explained that Elena's actions had strategic implications beyond the immediate tactical success. The enemy force that had been delayed and ultimately repelled at San Pedro represented a significant portion of their available combat strength in the region. Their losses in personnel and equipment would limit their ability to conduct future operations for weeks or possibly months. A communications specialist approached with an urgent message from regional headquarters. Elena's commanding officer wanted to speak with her directly via secure radio link. She was escorted to the communications center, where she found herself speaking with General Martinez, who, despite sharing her surname, was not related to her family. "Sergeant Martinez," the general's voice came through clearly despite the distance. "The entire command structure has been following your engagement today. Your performance under fire has been exemplary, and your tactical decisions showed judgment well beyond your rank and experience level." Elena responded appropriately to her superior officer, but she was more focused on the news that her family back home had been notified of her safety. She had not realized until that moment how worried she had been about her parents and siblings hearing incomplete or inaccurate reports about the day's fighting. The sun was now approaching the horizon, casting long golden rays across the battlefield where Elena had spent the most challenging day of her military career. The light had a quality that photographers call the golden hour, when everything seems to glow with warm, honey-colored illumination. Elena was finally given permission to rest and eat while the command staff completed their assessment of the tactical situation. She found a quiet corner of the village square where she could sit on a stone bench and watch the sunset while eating her first real meal since before dawn. As she ate, Elena reflected on the day's events and the choices she had made during the long hours of combat. She thought about the enemy soldiers she had been forced to engage, recognizing them as human beings who probably had families waiting for them at home, just as she did. War required such terrible choices, but she knew that her actions had been necessary to protect innocent civilians and fellow soldiers. A young medic approached and insisted on checking Elena for injuries despite her protests that she was unharmed. The examination revealed numerous small cuts and bruises from flying rock fragments, as well as severe dehydration that required immediate treatment with intravenous fluids. As the medical treatment continued, Elena watched the sun sink lower, toward the western mountains. The light was becoming more golden by the minute, creating a spectacular display of colors across the sky. It was the kind of sunset that under normal circumstances would have been simply beautiful, but after the day's events it seemed to represent something more profound. The radio crackled with a final update from the regional command. All enemy forces in the immediate area had withdrawn beyond effective range, and the threat to San Pedro had been permanently neutralized. The village was secure, the civilians were safe, and the strategic objectives had been achieved. Elena closed her eyes and allowed herself to truly relax for the first time in over 12 hours. She had held her ground when it mattered most, had made every shot count when ammunition was precious, and had proven herself under the most demanding circumstances imaginable. As the sun touched the horizon and began to disappear behind the mountains, Elena Martinez knew that this day would define the rest of her military career. She had faced the ultimate test of a sniper's skill and courage, and she had not been found wanting. The lady sniper who had held her ground for hours had written her name in the history of this small mountain village where a single bullet at sunset had indeed decided it all.